The monarchy demands the systematic suppression of the individual for the preservation of the institution. The crown remains indifferent to the inevitable frailty of human biology. At 77, King Charles III faces an adversary that cannot be negotiated with or outmaneuvered. A sovereign is denied the fundamental human right to a private convalescence. The rigorous itinerary of a state visit to Washington represents more than diplomacy. It is a calculated display of a spirit forced to override the limitations of the flesh. The weight of the crown is literal. For a man who spent decades advocating for environmental preservation and complex diplomacy, constitutional neutrality functions as a form of psychological exile. To embody the state, one must first surrender the luxury of a personal conscience. The monarch provides the ceremonial continuity for a political reality that may contradict his most deeply held convictions. Silence is the king's most profound sacrifice. Observations of the tortoise effect, a subtle, subconscious lowering of the head during high-stakes exchanges, reveal a physiological reaction to immense pressure. Protocol is the armor, but the man beneath is visible in the briefest moments of involuntary hesitation. He remains a prisoner of his own lineage. Duty is the discipline of remaining motionless while the mind navigates the singular struggle for survival. April 27th, 2026. Was intended as the definitive symbolic closure to a 2.5-century-old fracture. The sesquicentennial of American independence required the presence of the British sovereign to validate the endurance of the Atlantic Alliance. The atmosphere in the District of Columbia was not merely heavy, it was volatile. 48 hours before the king's arrival, the orchestrated peace of the Capitol was shattered. An assassination attempt on President Trump transformed a celebratory milestone into a security crucible. For the House of Windsor, a state visit is typically a choreographed exercise in soft power. In the wake of gunfire, it became a strategic insertion into a geopolitical fracture zone. The crown does not retreat. To cancel would be an admission that chaos dictates the terms of the state. While the American administration reeled, the king's itinerary remained immutable. His presence served as a stabilizer, a physical manifestation of continuity amidst the wreckage of democratic stability. Within the White House, the king encountered a presidency in a state of hypervigilance. The internal machinery of the executive branch was vibrating with the shock of the recent breach. Every formal greeting was a performance conducted against a backdrop of visceral unpredictability. Diplomacy, in this vacuum, is the unyielding endurance of the institution against the volatility of the present. The Oval Office, once the crucible of the special relationship, had become a site of profound ideological divergence. Beneath the professional veneer of the state visit lay a fractured alliance. Relations between London and Washington had reached a nadir over the escalating crisis in Iran. The American president's public dismissal of Prime Minister Keir Starmer, labeling him a shadow of Churchill, represented a calculated decapitation of British diplomatic standing. In this vacuum of executive rapport, the sovereign becomes the final bridge. For a populist presidency, the presence of the king provides a unique form of iconographic validation. Populism seeks to dismantle the establishment, while simultaneously coveting the aesthetic of its permanence. Inviting the House of Windsor into the inner sanctum, the executive branch attempts to harness 1,000 years of hereditary legitimacy. The king is not merely a guest. He is an instrument of historical continuity, used to stabilize a volatile present. The crown serves as a diplomatic lightning rod, absorbing the static of a fractured alliance to prevent a total surge. Charles remains the silent witness to a geopolitical realignment that threatens the post-war order. He is required to be a statue while the map of the world is redrawn in his presence. Neutrality is not an absence of opinion. It is a heavy garment, worn to mask the personal for the sake of the institutional. In this room, the monarch's reflection is no longer his own. It belongs entirely to the state's necessity for survival. History maintains a mathematical rhythm. In June 1939, George VI arrived in Washington to confront an isolationist America on the precipice of global collapse. The gathering at Hyde Park, dismissed by some as mere hot dog diplomacy, was a calculated deployment of the crown to breach American neutrality. It was the first time a reigning British monarch set foot on American soil. The human face of sovereignty achieved what professional diplomats could not. 87 years later, the crucible has shifted toward Tehran, yet the maneuvers of the British state remain identical. When the mechanisms of traditional governance fail and prime ministers are dismissed as inconsequential, the sovereign is activated. The king is the state's ultimate diplomatic lubricant. Charles III now navigates the same Atlantic chasm his grandfather once bridged. He must stabilize a presidency that views international alliances through a purely transactional lens. Soft power is the final reserve of a nation in crisis. While elected officials exchange volatile rhetoric, the crown preserves the skeletal architecture of the alliance. Monarchy acts as a silent insurance policy against the entropy of modern history. The weight of 1,000 years provides the gravity necessary to steady a world in freefall. Duty is the quiet, relentless endurance of the institution. The rostrum of the United States Congress functions as the ultimate theater of geopolitical validation. For the House of Windsor, this stage is a precision instrument, deployed only when the tectonic plates of the international order require recalibration. Charles III is the first British sovereign to ascend these steps since 1991. The diplomatic archives remember that visitation by the talking hat incident, a rare failure of choreography, where a misplaced podium obscured the countenance of Elizabeth II. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, that moment of unintended levity served a profound strategic purpose. It provided a human face to the institution at the exact moment the West asserted its absolute military hegemony. The human element softened the edge of power. 35 years later, the calculus has shifted from triumph to preservation. The king's appearance before the joint session functions as a ceremonial stabilization of an American leadership navigating a landscape of profound internal fractures. Hereditary legitimacy remains the most resilient currency in the global diplomatic market. By occupying this space, the king confers an aura of historical inevitability upon the state. This validation transcends the transience of the ballot box. The monarch does not engage in the friction of policy. He projects the weight of permanence. When alliances are tested by the volatile tides of populism, the aesthetic of unity becomes more critical than the mechanics of a treaty. The crown provides the structural integrity. Symbolism is the final barricade against the encroachment of chaos. The 2026 summit signaled the definitive realignment of sovereign power. Previous eras defined the crown by an impenetrable stoicism. The modern reality reveals a more precarious equilibrium. The physiological concessions observed in Washington were more than a momentary lapse. They marked the formal transition from the myth of the immovable statue to the reality of a vessel no longer immune to the tremors of the present. In this vacuum of stability, the monarchy functions as a diplomatic damper. As British foreign policy adapts to the transactional pragmatism of the White House, the king absorbs the resulting friction. He is the essential insulation between populist volatility and the requirements of traditional statecraft. The sovereign has become the shock absorber for a nation navigating a radical geopolitical realignment. This is the final metamorphosis of soft power. The crown now secures stability not through the illusion of invincibility, through the transparent dignity of its endurance. The institution survives, yet its luster is shadowed by the tangible cost of that survival. The weight of a millennium remains concentrated upon a single, palpably human frame. History does not pause for the weary. If you value this depth of analytical documentation, I invite you to subscribe. How do you perceive the evolving burden of the modern crown?